So this brought us to the next problem. Obviously, now Hanifaro Bay is a marine protected area. It's safe, but the tourism is increasing at a dramatic rate. And what is the impact of this tourism? You saw in the footage before that daily 100, 200 snorkelers, divers was visiting the bay. Boats were driving inside an area which is maybe the size of this auditorium. So it's a very tiny area. Accidents can happen. Hundreds of mantas there can be stroked by boat. So what's the impact? And we started studying that. So different students from York University in England came to do some specific studies on the impact of tourism. And one that I brought here was based on 400 human-manta interactions. So we're studying how mantas react to the presence of people in the water. And what came out is that about 50% of the encounters between a manta and a snorkeler or a diver have an impact that can be minimal or can be more intense, but half of them are reacting. So that means there is certainly an impact. Most of the reaction was an avoidance. Obviously, the manta, as it's swimming toward a diver or a snorkeler, avoids it, changes the path, which might stop from feeding and then restore feeding later. But obviously, that stops the manta from their natural behavior, what they're naturally doing inside that bay. So there is certainly an impact that we need to minimize and make sure it's at minimum. So remember also the guidelines and best practice code of conducts that were designed to minimize the impact. There were not regulations yet, but we studied how many of the boats that visited Hanifaro were actually following those guidelines that were actually drawn specifically to reduce as much as possible the impact of the manta resident population. And this is what the result was. So most of the boats are actually were not respecting those rules, especially poor conduct, so driving dangerously close to mantas and divers and snorkelers and people in the water, especially to pick up and drop divers and snorkelers. That bay is very small. The original guideline was for boats not to enter the bay, but drop people just on the sandy part, and then divers and snorkelers would swim inside the bay. But that was often quite hard to achieve because of currents, because of tired guests, and obviously boat would start driving inside the bay, risking of hitting even people in the water. So guidelines and code of conducts were not enough, as you can see, especially driving out of the bay. One of the main break into the guidelines that were designed was the driving inside the bay, speed exceed, poor conduct of the boat, etc. And here again, you can see how much the tourism boomed after the 2009 declaration of the marine protected area and the publication of many different articles. During the months of August, especially, peaks of 150, even 200 snorkelers were visiting the bay at one time. So we were in a very extreme need for a management plan, a proper and official management plan to make sure that Hanifaro is protected, that the manta population is safeguarded, and make sure also that this is something that we will be able to enjoy for generations to come. Our kids, our grandkids will still be able to enjoy the massive, the fantastic and fascinating events that happen at Hanifaro Bay. The government obviously jumped on it right away, especially also working together with the Manta Trust, with students, with local communities as well, to come up with an efficient and a properly designed management plan to minimize the impact of mantas, but also obviously allow tourism development and local development, because finally we're also talking about development of the local community. And in 2011, after about a year of discussions and collaboration studies, etc., by both governmental agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, Ministry of Environment, and organizations like the Manta Trust, finally a final draw of a management plan for Hanifaro Bay was drawn and accepted and turned into a proper legislation. So those guidelines that were only guidelines as code of conduct at first became actual regulations that even fines were put in place for breaking those regulations. There was still a problem, and the problem was the lack of enforcement. So those regulations were there, the legislation was there, but obviously without an enforcement, nobody will actually follow those. And studies also show that even after the legislation was officialized, the impact was still there. Boats were still poorly thriving inside the bay. Extra number of people from what was allowed were visiting the bay. And this brought the need for also an enforcement. So rangers in 2012 started patrolling the site, and this obviously dramatically reduced the impact of the breaking of regulations. The number of people in the water at one time was always respected, and so were also the driving of the boats inside the bay. The last step was the ban of scuba diving in 2012, which came a bit with discordance, but as you could see from the video, the number of divers could reach 50, 60. Bubbles would drop the visibility in the water, displace the plankton. Also, because of the currents, divers need to be often picked up from inside the bay, which can put in danger both snorkelers, divers themselves, and mantas. In an area which is the size of a football pitch, diving is not really also the best way to experience a manta aggregation, where they feed mostly at the surface. But as a result of the diving ban, the number of liveaboards visiting Hanifaru dramatically dropped in 2012, together also with a drop in sightings of mantas. Also, I want to put your attention to the fact that in 2011-12 there was quite a sudden drop in number of sightings and consistency of manta sightings in Hanifaru Bay. We don't know exactly what the reasons are. They might be probably related to climatic change, global climatic change. The weekend of the Maldivian monsoon, obviously, as I showed you before, what makes Hanifaru special and the Maldives special is the strong monsoonal currents that create those nutrient blooms and plankton blooms. But when the monsoon is not as intense, this doesn't happen, and mantas are obviously directly affected by it. And I'm sure you know better than me, when you're able to tell me even in more detail, that in the last few years, the southwest monsoon, the Hulango, has not been as intense as it was in previous years. So not constant strong winds. Often throughout the entire month of the Hulango, it's calm sea, which is very unusual for the country. Am I right? Right. So this directly affected mantas. So as a result of both the ban on scuba diving and the weekend of the monsoon, number of liveaboards visiting the site dropped. And we are actually hoping that this number will come up, will grow again. In fact, 2013 already it increases again after the ban of diving. And the importance is to realize that the resource can be still enjoyed and used by users like tourists in different ways. A lot of liveaboards as well as resorts now bring guests only snorkeling in the site, which is the best way, in my opinion, to experience Hanifaru Bay. So Batol became sort of an example for the Maldives as well. It was just the first step, and with dozens of marine protected areas in the country, this was an example to be then expanded, and hopefully all important marine protected areas in the Maldives will be managed appropriately in order to, again, minimize the impact of the importance marine reserve. Well, is that it? Are we done with Hanifaru? Are we at a successful and satisfied point? Actually, not really. It's not that easy. Although we have now regulations, we have rangers there, there's still some points we have to work on. Real penalties for offenders. So breaking the regulations, touching a manta, chasing a manta, and I've seen that myself, even now that the regulations are actually law. People trying to probably grab manta rays and nobody there to actually enforce that or penalize the person who breaks those regulations and impact on the manta. So this is something that definitely has to be worked on. Enforcement by rangers. The rangers, there is a group of rangers patrolling the area, but the patrolling is not consistent. Especially last year has not been very consistent at all. So there are days where regulations have been broken, entering the bay from the wrong side, again because of the not constant presence of enforcement. Finally, a marine protected area should not just preserve the environment itself, but should create job opportunities. The income generated through, for example, tokens into Hanifaro, entering Hanifaro is now priced through tokens by the Environmental Protection Agency. This money obviously should go straight back into the local community for development project, education, and this is fundamental job opportunities. So we have rangers now. Obviously, Baha Atoll is a UNESCO biosphere, and as a UNESCO biosphere, it can create a lot of job opportunities, especially obviously in biological fields. So you guys studying, hopefully, one day you'll be managing and leading projects into Baha Atoll, but in the Maldives in general. And I personally believe that the importance of the involvement of local communities, especially when we're talking about local resources like the Maldives. I'm Italian, and I'm working here in the Maldives as a biologist, here managing the project on mantas, but my biggest hope is that one day someone will take my place, and that someone will be a passionate and smart Maldivian who will be able to lead the project in my place. And so it should be for all biological projects around the Maldives. Conservation should be led by locals, that's no doubt about it. And what's the best way? Then education, like what I'm doing today, what IUCN has been supporting, and what Baha Atoll now as a UNESCO biosphere should support as well. Obviously, we want to continue research mantas. We know still very little about them. Hanifaro is a great place to study them. We're still studying the impact on tourism. For example, just last year, a very interesting study on the human interaction toward mantas showed different reaction when we are observing different aggregation of mantas, male and female. So we actually learned that females react less than males to human presence. Mantas during aggregations also are less responsive to the presence of humans, while individuals feeding mantas are much more susceptible. Juveniles as well seem to be more affected by humans than adults. This is probably due to the fact that adults learned and got used to the presence of humans in the water. And obviously all these data also allow us to even improve the code of conducts and the management plan for specific sites. If we know that's a juvenile site, we have to address it in a certain way. If we know that a particular site we want to protect is visited mostly by adults, we're probably going to draw a different management plan for that site. This brought us just this year to draw a final code of conduct based on all the studies that we've been doing on the tourism impact and the reaction of mantas. And this is something we hope that one day will be also included officially as a legislation, not only in Hanifaro, but throughout the country. There's many other important manta stations. Why is it so important to protect mantas? Well, I'm sure by now you know very well these are slow-growing species that reach maturity, sexual maturity, only at the age about 10, 15, that give birth to only one pup every 5, 6 years on average. So throughout an entire life, mantas are thought to live a minimum of 45, 50 years. They might give birth to only 5, 6 pups at a time. So it's a very slow reproductive species that can be easily affected by impact by tourism or by overfishing, climate changes, etc. Mantas are also important as an indicator species. They are very susceptible to climate change, to acidification in the water, because they feed on plankton, which is the primary productivity. As soon as an example was that the drop in productivity in the last few years, mantas can be used as an indicator of environmental pollution or climate and global change that can be addressed appropriately. What are the sustainable solutions? As the example I brought here, obviously tourism is a much better solution than fishing, and we're hoping that all the countries that are still fishing mantas will switch to tourism, which is much more worth in terms of revenue and also impact much less. But tourism is not only doesn't only bring good. Obviously, tourism has to be performed in a sustainable way, and that's why the example of Hanifaro Bay and how the marine protected area has been designed and officialized. It's it's an example of kind of a balance between protecting a species and providing opportunities, economic opportunities, and for exploiting a site. Really love this question, which is, I think every conservationist Bible, sort of, or Quran. So in the end, this is what Baba Diom said. Finally, we will conserve only what we love. We will love only what we understand, and we understand only what we are taught. And again, this brings me to the importance of education. Educating, raising awareness about conservation, about marine resources. So, and this is why we are hoping to expand on an educational program in Ba Atoll, but also around the Maldives, which I know IUCN is also working on.